A woman scrubs windows on the 47th floor of a criminal empire she doesn't know she owns. One song changes everything. One bloodline resurfaces from 30 years of ash. And the most dangerous man in Chicago realizes, too late, that the girl cleaning his glass was never beneath him. She was always above him. Watch until the end. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The cloth moved in slow circles across the glass, and Celine Vale counted her breaths the way she'd learned to count everything that mattered. Quietly, precisely, without letting anyone see that she was doing it at all. 47 floors up, Chicago looked like a different world. The kind of world that existed behind glass and required a keycard to enter. Down below, the city moved in its usual rhythm of horns and weather and human urgency. Up here, there was only silence and the squeak of her cloth against the window and the faint ache in her lower back from 6 hours of work she would not complain about because complaining was a luxury she'd given up at 19. She was 26 now. The Russo Tower penthouse occupied the entire upper floor of the building, though calling it a penthouse felt inadequate. It was more like a statement, a physical declaration that the man who lived here had placed himself above the ordinary laws of architecture, economics, and apparently everything else. Marble floors that reflected the ceiling lights like still water. Furniture that looked like it cost more than her annual salary several times over. Art on the walls that Celine didn't understand but recognized as expensive. In the way you recognize expensive things even when you've never owned them. By the silence around them, by the careful lighting, by the absence of price tags. She cleaned here twice a week, always when he wasn't home. That had been the arrangement for 8 months. Thornwood Luxury Concierge Services sent 3 of them up on Tuesdays and Fridays, Celine and 2 other women, Rosa and Diane, and they moved through the penthouse in practiced silence with their supplies and their company-issued uniforms and their carefully maintained invisibility. The protocol was strict. Don't touch personal items on the main desk. Don't enter the Northeast office without prior clearance. Don't use the private elevator that went directly to the parking level. Don't linger. Don't ask questions. Leave no trace except clean surfaces. Celine had never broken any of those rules. She was good at rules. She'd had to be. The window she was working on now stretched floor to ceiling along the north face of the building and overlooked Lakeshore Drive, where headlights were beginning to blur in the early evening rain. The storm had come in fast from the lake, the way Chicago storms always did, with no warning and complete commitment. Rain hammered against the glass from the other side, and Celine worked against it, matching the storm's intensity with methodical strokes, and without meaning to, she began to hum. It was an old melody. She didn't know when she'd started doing it. Humming while she worked had been a habit since childhood, a small private sound she made to fill silence that would otherwise grow too heavy. Her grandmother had sung this particular tune in the kitchen of their apartment in Queens while making Sunday dinner, a low, unhurried melody that moved like water over smooth stones. Celine had never known what language it was, had never thought to ask. Her grandmother was a woman of few explanations and absolute certainties, and the song was simply the song, as much a part of the household as the smell of garlic and the sound of the old radiator clicking through the winter. Celine hummed it now against the rain and the city and the quiet of the empty penthouse and let her mind drift to Noah, who had a follow-up appointment tomorrow that she needed to leave 40 minutes early for, which meant asking Rosa to cover the last section of the West Corridor, which Rosa would do but would remember, and which Celine would repay with the Tuesday assignment Rosa disliked, the one that required moving all the furniture in the dining room to clean underneath. She was running the arithmetic of the favor exchange in her head when the voice came from behind her. "You know that song doesn't belong to ordinary people." The cloth stopped moving. Everything stopped moving. Celine turned with the slow, deliberate care of someone who had just heard a sound in a room that was supposed to be empty and was choosing not to panic about it. Her heart was doing something uncooperative in her chest, but she kept her face neutral because neutral was a survival skill she'd developed long before she understood why she needed it. Damien Russo stood in the doorway of the Northeast office. She'd never seen him in person before. Photographs existed, the kind that appeared in the financial press when one of his legitimate holding companies acquired something significant, or in the society pages when he attended the right charity events for reasons that had nothing to do with charity. In photographs, he looked like what he was, a man of consequence who had learned to wear consequence the way other men wore suits. In person, he was something different, taller than she'd expected, lean without being spare, the kind of build that suggested controlled use rather than maintenance. The suit was black, cut close, and his tie was loosened with the particular casualness of someone who had been working for a long time and didn't care who knew it. There was a scar beneath his left eye, a clean white line about 2 inches long that the photographs never showed clearly. His hair was dark and slightly overgrown, and his eyes were the color of deep water just before it goes dark. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not anger, not the impatience of a man who'd found an employee where he didn't expect one. Something more focused than that, more unsettling. I wasn't, she started. Where did you learn it? Not a question. The phrasing was too flat for a question, too direct. He said it the way you say something when the answer already matters to you and you're measuring the person against whatever answer they give. My grandmother, Celine said. The silence that followed was the strangest silence she'd ever stood inside. Something moved across his face. A shift too quick to track fully, there and gone before she could name it. But she felt the temperature of the room change, felt the weight of his attention alter, become something she couldn't quite categorize, but that made her want to step backward toward the window and assess her exits. She didn't step backward. She didn't look at the exits. She stood with the cleaning cloth in her hand and waited. What's your name? He said. Celine Vale. He said nothing for a moment, just looked at her. Then he stepped back into the office, and the door didn't close fully behind him, and his voice came through the gap, quieter now, directed at someone else in the room she hadn't known was occupied. Get Marco. Tell him to come up. Celine stood in the middle of the penthouse living room with her heart doing mathematics she didn't understand, and the rain still hammering the glass behind her, and somewhere at the edge of her hearing, the city going about its business 47 floors below, indifferent. She should have left. Looking back later, much later, in rooms she hadn't yet imagined standing in, wearing things she hadn't yet imagined wearing, she would identify this as the first of many moments when leaving was still available to her and she didn't take it. She would ask herself why. She would never have a clean answer. Something kept her feet on the marble floor of Damien Rousseau's penthouse while she waited for a man named Marco and for whatever came next. Maybe it was the way he'd said the song didn't belong to ordinary people. Maybe it was the things she'd seen move across his face when she gave her last name. Maybe she was just tired enough that the unusual felt easier than making another decision. The door opened again. Damien came back into the room, and behind him was a man she recognized from the photographs. Marco Vitelli, Damien's head of security, with a square face and careful eyes and the posture of someone who had spent decades making himself useful in rooms where being useful was the difference between staying and not staying. Marco looked at her. Something happened in his expression that she didn't know how to read. Leave us, Damien said, and it took Celine a moment to understand he was talking to Marco, not to her. Marco left. He closed the door behind him with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood when he'd just witnessed something significant. Damien sat down on the edge of the large, low table that served as the centerpiece of the seating area. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and he looked at her the way you look at something you've been searching for and aren't sure yet how to feel about finding. Your grandmother, he said. What was her name? Celine's jaw tightened slightly. That's not... I work here. I'm not... This isn't appropriate. I should go back to... What was her name? Elda, she said, and hated herself a little for how quickly she answered. Elda Ferrante. She died 3 years ago. Ferrante, he said, and the word came out slowly, like he was tasting it and confirming something. That was the name she used. What does that mean, that was the name she used? It means she had another one before it. He looked at her steadily. It means she was born with a different name in a different country, and she came here to disappear, and she did a very good job of it for a very long time. The ache in Celine's lower back was still there. She was still holding the cleaning cloth. The details felt important. They anchored her to something ordinary, while his words pulled at something she couldn't see yet. You're talking about my grandmother, she said carefully, like you knew her. I didn't, but I knew of her family. He paused. I know of your family. I don't have a family. I have a sick brother and a grandmother who died, and that's the entire... Sit down, Celine. I'm not going to... Please. The word surprised her into silence. It sat wrong in his mouth. Not wrong like he said it badly, but wrong like it was a word he rarely used and its appearance meant something. She sat. Not because he asked her to, because her legs had decided the conversation warranted it. Damien stood up and moved to the bar against the south wall and poured 2 inches of something into a glass and set it on the table in front of her without asking if she wanted it. And then sat again, closer this time, close enough that she could see the scar more clearly. The skin around it was slightly different in texture. Old damage, healed imperfectly, the kind of scar that came from something sharp and serious. Your mother's name was, he said. Don't, she said. Lucia. She felt something cold run through her chest. How do you know that? Your grandfather's name was Enzo. Your great-grandfather was called the Old King in 3 languages, and none of them were flattering. Your family name, your real family name, the one your grandmother buried and never spoke aloud again. Stop. Was Vale. The rain. That was the only sound in the room for a moment, rain against glass and her own breathing and the distant hum of the building's climate system and nothing else. Vale isn't a secret name, she said. That's my name. I've always had that. She kept part of it, Damien said. She couldn't let go of all of it. That's how they are, how your family was. Names weren't just names, they were architecture. She kept Vale because losing everything would have killed her faster than the people hunting her. People hunting her, Celine repeated. She heard how flat her voice was. She heard herself retreating into a register she used when she needed to process something without showing that she was processing it. Nobody was hunting my grandmother. She was a 73-year-old woman who grew vegetables on her fire escape and watched game shows. Before that, she was a young woman who came from Sicily with nothing and built a life. Before that, she was the last surviving member of a family that ran the eastern Sicilian territories for 4 generations and was almost entirely wiped out in a single night 30 years ago. He said it without cruelty, without drama. The way you deliver facts that are terrible but settled. 9 people. 1 night. A harbor house outside of Palermo. The men who did it burned the house afterward and spent the next 3 decades telling everyone the Vale bloodline was finished. Celine looked at him. She looked at his face and tried to find the angle, the con, the reason a man like this would construct a story like this for a cleaning woman he had never met before tonight. She couldn't find it. That scared her more than the story. My grandmother never mentioned... She wouldn't have. That was the point of surviving. He leaned forward slightly. Celine, the song you were humming, do you know what it is? She shook her head slowly. It's a Vale family ritual, passed down from the women. It was sung at marriages and at burials and before any gathering where important decisions were made. It's not a folk song. It's not a lullaby your grandmother happened to know. It's specific to one family in a specific province, and it has never been recorded, and the only people who know it are people who were raised inside that family. He paused. Or people who were taught it deliberately. She taught it to me when I was 4, Celine said quietly. I know. She said it was something her mother sang. Her mother sang it to her, and her mother's mother before that. Yes. Celine looked down at the glass he'd poured for her. She hadn't touched it. She looked at it now and thought about her grandmother's hands. The way they moved when she cooked, the efficiency of them, the lack of wasted motion. She thought about the way Elda had never talked about Sicily, had never explained the absence of any family beyond the 2 of them, had deflected every question about her origins with the patient skill of someone who had practiced deflection until it became indistinguishable from truth. She thought about how Elda had taught her the song, how she had made Celine learn it exactly, every note, every phrasing, how she had corrected her gently but persistently until it was right, and how when it was right, her grandmother had sat with a stillness that Celine had never understood, a stillness that felt like something heavier than satisfaction, like completion, like she was passing something along that mattered in a way she couldn't explain. Why are you telling me this? Celine said. Because the men who burned that harbor house are still alive, Damien said. And one of them learned 2 hours ago that a woman with your last name is employed by a service that works in this building. The cold in her chest spread. What? His name is Lucian Moretti. He's 71 years old, and he controls the most significant criminal network currently operating in the northeastern territories of this country and 3 Western European markets. He ordered the massacre of your family in 1994 because the Veil Syndicate was the only organization powerful enough to challenge his expansion into Sicily. He has spent 30 years believing the job was finished. Damien looked at her steadily. He found out tonight that it wasn't. Celine stood up. The cleaning cloth was still in her hand. She realized she'd been gripping it without noticing. I need to call my brother, she said. Noah is already… What? My people picked him up from the apartment 40 minutes ago. He's safe. He's on his way here. She stared at him. You had someone go to my brother's apartment. I had someone go to your brother's apartment to keep him alive. Yes. Without telling me, without asking. There wasn't time to ask. There may still not be enough time. He stood up too, and for the first time she noticed he was slightly taller than she'd registered before, and that the ease with which he occupied his own body was the ease of someone who had been in danger many times and had metabolized it into something functional. I understand you're angry. That's appropriate. But you need to understand that the situation outside this building is already in motion, and the window for managing it is closing. The situation, she said. Lucian Moretti wants you dead. Because of a song. Because of what you are. He looked at her without apology or softness. You're the heir to a syndicate he thought he'd destroyed. Your existence, just your existence, destabilizes 30 years of power structure, properties that were seized, territories that were absorbed, agreements that were built on the assumption of a veil vacuum. Your survival doesn't just embarrass him, it threatens everything he's built since 1994. Celine's hands were very still. She was aware of her own stillness, the enforced quality of it, the cost. I clean windows, she said. I have $2,000 in a savings account, and my brother has a chronic kidney condition, and I work 60 hours a week to cover what his insurance doesn't. I don't know anything about syndicates. I don't know anything about Sicily. I barely know anything about my grandmother's life before Queen's, and she's been dead for 3 years, and I am not… She stopped, started again. I am not what you're describing. You are exactly what I'm describing, Damien said quietly. You just weren't raised knowing it. Then it doesn't matter. If I don't know who I am, if I have no organization, it matters because of what your blood represents, because of what it means to the men who remember what it meant. He stepped closer, not crowding her, just reducing the distance between them to something more direct. And it matters because I'm not going to let Lucian Moretti finish what he started in 1994. Why? The word came out raw. What do you get out of this? He looked at her for a moment before answering. Something moved through his expression, not sentiment, but something adjacent to it, something complicated and controlled. The Vale family and the Russo family were allies once, he said, before Moretti broke everything apart. What exists between our families now is a debt unpaid for 30 years. He paused. And because the alliance that Moretti destroyed would have prevented a great deal of what happened afterward, what continues to happen. He paused again, and she got the sense he was measuring each word. Consider it strategic. Consider it whatever you need to consider it. But you're staying here tonight, and we're going to talk about what comes next. You're not asking, she said. No. You don't ask people things. Not usually. Celine looked around the penthouse, at the windows she'd been cleaning, at the city below, at the rain, at the man standing in front of her with his loosened tie and his careful eyes, and his scar, and his 30-year-old story about her dead grandmother's secret name. I want to see my brother, she said. He'll be here within the hour. I want to see him the moment he arrives. Agreed. And I want… She stopped, adjusted, started again with something smaller and more immediate and more honest. I want to know what the song means, the one she taught me. I want to know what it actually says. Damien was quiet for a moment. It's a declaration, he said finally. In the old dialect, roughly translated, it says, "The blood returns to the sea from which it came, and the sea does not forget." He paused. "Your grandmother sang it to you every week for 20 years. Celine felt something shift in her chest. Not pain exactly, something older than pain. A recognition of weight she'd been carrying without knowing she was carrying it. She didn't say anything. Outside, the rain came harder. Below, the city moved. Somewhere in a black car on a Chicago street, her brother was being transported toward a building he'd never been in by men he didn't know, because their dead grandmother had once sung a song to the wrong people's ears. Rosa and Diane were probably still in the building, probably finishing the West Corridor, probably waiting for Celine to sign off on the supply checkout before leaving. She thought about texting Rosa to cover it. She thought about how her entire ordinary life was already becoming the past tense. She sat back down. She picked up the glass Damien had poured and drank from it, and set it back down and looked at him with the steady expression she'd been developing since she was old enough to understand that the world punished visible uncertainty. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Tell me everything about my family." He nodded once, and across the city, in a building she would never know the address of, a 71-year-old man named Lucian Moretti was already making calls. End of part 1. Noah Vale weighed 138 pounds and looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts, too tall for his frame, joints that seemed slightly too large. The particular thinness of someone whose body had been fighting something for so long that winning was no longer the point. He walked into the penthouse with his hands shoved into the pocket of his hoodie and his eyes moving across the room the way their grandmother's eyes used to move across unfamiliar spaces, fast, cataloging, looking for exits before he looked for anything else. Celine crossed the room in 4 steps and grabbed him by the shoulders, and he let her, which meant he was scared because normally he would have made a comment about the contact. "Are you okay?" she said into his shoulder. "I'm fine. Some guy in a black car told me to get in, and I figured either I do or I don't, and then I did, and now I'm here." He pulled back enough to look at her face. His eyes, dark like hers, dark like their grandmother's, searched her expression with the practiced speed of someone who had spent his whole life reading her moods for information she wasn't offering voluntarily. "What is going on?" "I'm going to explain." "You're going to explain why 2 men in suits showed up at my door at 8 o'clock at night, and one of them put his hand inside his jacket when he knocked." He looked past her at Damien, who was standing near the windows with Marco at his shoulder, both of them giving the siblings the room without actually leaving it. "Is that him?" "Yes." "He looks like a villain." "Noah." "I'm just saying." But he lowered his voice. "Celine, seriously, what is this?" She told him. Not all of it. Not yet. She gave him the architecture without the full weight. Grandmother's real name, real family, the massacre, the man who ordered it, the song. She watched his face move through disbelief and resistance, and the particular stillness he got when something landed in him that he didn't know how to immediately process. He stood very still and let her talk, and when she finished, he looked at the floor for a moment and then looked back up. "The lullaby," he said. "Yes." "The one she made us both learn." "Yes." "I always thought it was just—" "I know." He exhaled. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it had the shape of one. The dark, involuntary kind that surfaces when something is too strange to meet any other way. Then he looked past her again at Damien, and his expression went flat and careful the way it went when he was deciding something. "What does he want?" Noah said. Not quietly enough. Damien answered from across the room without moving. "To keep you both alive tonight. After that, we can negotiate the rest." Noah looked at him. "Negotiate?" "It's a word I use to describe conversations where both parties want something. Yes." "What do you want?" "That's a longer conversation than we have time for right now." Damien straightened from the window. "There are 2 guest rooms on the east end. You'll stay here tonight. My people are watching the building, and the exterior perimeter is covered. In the morning, we'll talk about next steps." "We're not prisoners," Celine said. "No." "That means we can leave." "It means you're choosing not to," Damien said. Because you understand that leaving right now is the more dangerous option. She did understand that. She hated understanding it. Marco showed them the rooms. They were larger than Celine's apartment, larger than both of their apartments combined, and furnished with the same cold, expensive restraint as the rest of the penthouse. She sat on the edge of the bed in the first room after Noah disappeared into the second and looked at her own hands for a long time. There were calluses on her right palm from the cleaning equipment. There was a small scar on her left wrist from a broken piece of glass she'd dropped 3 years ago during a job in Gold Coast. Her nails were short and unpolished. She tried to imagine these hands belonging to an heir. She couldn't. She lay down without taking off her shoes and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. At some point in the early morning hours, she heard voices. Damien and Marco in the corridor outside, too low to catch the words, but carrying the cadence of something urgent. She heard Damien say a name she didn't recognize. She heard Marco say something that contained the word Palermo. Then silence. She was still staring at the ceiling when the city outside the windows went from black to gray. Damien was already at the long table in the main room when she came out, with a coffee and a laptop and a spread of papers she couldn't read from the doorway. He looked up when she entered, looked at her shoes, which she'd slept in, but said nothing about it. "There's coffee," he said. She got coffee. She sat down across from him without being invited to and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the papers. Photographs, maps, documents with letterheads she couldn't make out. "Tell me about the Moretti family," she said. He told her. He told her efficiently, the way he did everything, without ornamentation, with the precise emphasis of a man who had learned to communicate information quickly because delay had consequences. The Moretti network, its current reach, its relationship to the other families that controlled the northeastern territories. He told her about Lucian, the man's particular intelligence, his patience, his preference for proxy operations over direct action, his capacity for waiting years to settle debts. "He'll move carefully," Damien said. "He won't send people directly at this building. That's too loud and too attributable. He'll look for a softer approach first." "Like what?" "Information. He'll want to confirm what he knows before committing resources, which means we have a window before he acts decisively." He paused. "A short one." "How short?" "Days. Maybe less." Celine drank her coffee and looked at the photograph of Lucian Moretti that Damien had placed on the table. 71 years old, silver-haired, lean, the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and was now just precise. Every feature settled into its final position, nothing wasted. He was photographed at what looked like a charity dinner, tuxedo, glass of wine, the practiced smile of a man who had spent decades being photographed at events like this one. "He looks like a banker," she said. "He used to think that was funny," Damien said. "Now he just thinks it's accurate." "You know him personally?" "We've been in the same room. We've had conversations where both of us understood what was and wasn't being said. That's not the same as knowing someone." He closed the laptop. "He respected your family, before. He respected them enough to be afraid of them, which is the only kind of respect that matters in this world. And then he killed them. And then he decided that respect and fear were less useful than territory." Noah appeared from the corridor, looking like he'd slept about as well as Celine had, which was not at all. He poured coffee without speaking, stood at the counter drinking it, looked at the papers on the table. "So what's the plan?" he said. "We just stay here forever?" "No," Damien said. "Then what?" "We make the situation untenable for Moretti to act against you. We make the cost of moving against the Vale bloodline higher than the cost of acknowledging it." Noah looked at him. "How do you make a 70-year-old crime boss decide not to kill someone he's already decided to kill? You give him a reason to want you alive more than he wants you dead." Damien looked between them. "Which requires Celine to step into a position that makes her an asset rather than a loose end." The room was quiet. "I'm sorry," Celine said. "Step into a position." The Vale family held something in the old structure of this network that no one else can replicate. Lineage, legitimacy in the eyes of the families that remember. There are men, old men, cautious men, men who operate by codes that Lucian Moretti has been quietly eroding for 30 years, who would realign if the Vale name resurfaced behind a credible claimant. "I clean windows," she said again. You have blood, Damien said. The rest is learning. She stared at him. You're talking about turning me into something I'm not. I'm talking about turning you into something you already are and haven't been allowed to know. He said it without heat, like it was obvious. You've been surviving on 60-hour weeks and hospital debt and the sheer force of your own competence for years. All of that is real. All of that is yours. I'm saying direct it somewhere it can't be taken from you. This is insane, Noah said. This is the situation, Damien said. My sister is not... Noah. Celine's voice was quiet. He stopped. She looked at him and something passed between them, the compressed language of siblings who had been only each other's family for a long time. Let me think. You shouldn't have to think about this. This isn't... Celine, this isn't our world. Maybe it always was, she said. We just weren't told. That landed. She saw it land. Noah looked at her the way he looked at her when she said something that hid a truth he didn't want to accept, with the particular expression of someone who is updating their understanding of the world and finding the process unpleasant. He looked down at his coffee. He didn't argue further. The next 4 days happened the way emergency weeks always happened, in a compressed, slightly unrealistic blur where time moved wrong and ordinary life felt like something from a different dimension. Celine's phone went to Rosa with a brief message about a family emergency and the number for the agency. Her apartment was left locked. Noah's medication was sent for by Marco's people, picked up by someone she never saw. Damien worked. That was the only way to describe it. He was always working, on the phone, at the table, in brief meetings with men who came to the penthouse and left within the hour. He moved through his days with the focused efficiency of someone who treated time as a finite resource that was currently hemorrhaging, and he applied that same efficiency to Celine. He started the morning of the second day. Come, he said, appearing in the doorway of her room at 7 in the morning with a second coffee and no preamble. I haven't... You've been awake for an hour. I heard you moving. He set the coffee inside the door. Come to the study. She came. The northeast office that she'd never been permitted to enter during her 8 months of cleaning this building turned out to be less of an office than a war room. Maps on 2 walls. Not decorative, not tourism. Maps with overlays, with handwritten notations, with colored pins and drawn routes. A second desk covered in photographs and documents. Shelves of files. A safe she noticed but didn't ask about. Damien sat across from her and began to teach her. He started with structure, how the network operated, who reported to whom, how decisions moved through the organization, where the pressure points were. He was a precise teacher, not patient in the warm sense, patient in the way a surgeon is patient, because imprecision had consequences he was unwilling to accept. He corrected her when she misunderstood something. He didn't soften the correction. That's wrong, he said, the first time she summarized a relationship incorrectly. I know it is. I was just, if you know it's wrong, don't say it. She looked at him. That's not how thinking out loud works. In this room, right now, thinking out loud can establish patterns. Bad patterns are harder to break than no pattern at all. He held her gaze. When you're in a room with someone who is measuring you, you don't reveal the edge of your understanding. You reveal the center of it. I'm not in a room with someone measuring me. I'm in a room with you. You're always in a room with someone measuring you, he said. The ones who don't look like they're doing it are the most dangerous. She argued with him, more than once, more than twice. She argued about the pace of the information, about the assumptions he made regarding what she could absorb, about the hours he kept, about the way he gave directives without explanation. Tell me why, she said on the third day, when he told her something about the relationship between 2 families and moved on without elaboration. Don't just tell me what. Tell me why. He looked at her. Because it doesn't stick otherwise, she said. I'm not memorizing names. I need to understand how things work, or I'll have information without the ability to use it, and that's actually worse. You're right, he said. She stopped. He said it without apology or surprise, just acknowledged it and adjusted, and that was somehow more disorienting than if he'd argued. You're right, he said again. The why is more important than the what. I'll adjust. The arguments became something else over those days. Not softer. If anything, they sharpened, became more specific, because they were now arguing about things that both of them knew well enough to argue about precisely. She pushed back on his assessments. He pushed back on hers. He stopped explaining himself defensively and started explaining himself because the explanation was useful and she could tell the difference. She started to look forward to it. That was the part she didn't tell Noah. She also didn't tell Noah what happened on the evening of the third day. When they were still in the study at midnight and the city was spread outside the windows and Damien had gone quiet in the middle of explaining something, just stopped and looked at her with an expression she couldn't categorize, something she'd never seen on his face in the days she'd been watching it. "What?" she said. "Nothing. You stopped. I was thinking." "About?" He looked at the window for a moment. "About the fact that you've retained everything I've told you in 3 days and you're already asking questions I don't have complete answers to." He looked back at her. "Your grandmother would have, He stopped. "Would have what?" "Been proud," he said. Then, like he'd said something that required correcting, "She was a remarkable woman, Elda. The old families talked about her as a ghost for years after the massacre, the one that got away, the one who had the sense to run." A pause. "She gave you more than the song." Celine didn't respond. The grief was there. It was always there, 3 years in, still sharp in unexpected moments, but she kept it behind her teeth. "She also gave me the debt," she said. "What debt?" "The one where I have to decide what to do with everything she didn't tell me." Her voice was even. "I spent my life thinking I understood where I came from. I built my whole sense of myself on surviving what I thought I was surviving. And now I find out the floor I was standing on was something completely different." She looked at him. "That's a debt. You inherit what you're given whether you wanted it or not." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Is that how you understand it? What you inherited?" "What I inherited was cleaner," he said. "I always knew what it was. There's a different weight to knowing and choosing than there is to not knowing and being chosen." He paused. "I think what you're carrying is heavier." The honesty in it surprised her. She didn't show that it surprised her. She went back to the questions about the network. It was Marco who told her about Damien's shoulder on the 4th morning, mentioned it briefly in the context of something else, and she caught it. "What happened to his shoulder?" she said. Marco's expression went careful. "Old injury." "How old?" 5 years. "From what?" Marco looked at her with the measuring expression he'd had since the first night, the one she still hadn't fully decoded. "He took a round during an operation that didn't go as planned. The man who shot him was someone he'd trusted for 11 years. He paused. "He recovered. The man who shot him did not. And the shoulder gives him trouble in cold weather. He doesn't mention it. I've noticed he holds that side differently when he's been standing too long." Marco looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "He does." She didn't ask anything else. The call came on the afternoon of the 4th day. Damien took it in the northeast office with the door closed and Marco outside it, and the conversation lasted 22 minutes, and when the door opened, Damien's face had the particular quality she was beginning to recognize. The quality of controlled tension, the surface stillness over something that was moving fast underneath. He looked at Marco first. "Lucian wants a meeting," he said. "When?" "He's proposing day after tomorrow, the Meridian Hotel. Public enough to be manageable, private enough to be real. He'll have people in the building." "Of course he will." Celine had come into the corridor. Both men looked at her. She looked at Damien. "Does he know I'm here?" she said. "He suspects. He's proposing the meeting in part to verify." He held her gaze. "He's proposing me as the counterparty. He doesn't know yet how much you know or how capable you are. He thinks you're a frightened woman who stumbled into something she doesn't understand." "Let him keep thinking that," she said. Damien went still. "At the meeting," she said, "let him think I'm exactly what he expects. Someone scared and confused and in over her head. And then don't let me be that." Something shifted in Damien's expression. Not surprise. Something more specific. The recalibration of an assumption. "You want to be in the room," he said. "I need to see him." If he's going to be the thing I'm measured against for however long this takes, I need to see how he moves, how he reads the room, where he looks when he's deciding something. She paused. You said I need to learn to read fear in negotiations. There's no classroom for that. It's not safe. You said we have a window before he acts decisively. This is inside the window. She crossed her arms. And you also said that what makes me useful is being a credible claimant. A woman who hides in a penthouse for a week isn't credible. A woman who walks into a room with Lucian Moretti and doesn't break is. Marco made a sound that might have been disagreement. Damien looked at her for a long moment. You understand what credible costs, he said. In that room, with that man. Tell me. It costs the option to leave before you're ready to leave. If you walk into a negotiation and you show weakness, not fear, weakness, there's a difference. He'll use that for the rest of your life. First impressions in this world don't fade. They calcify. Then I won't be weak. You've had 4 days. My grandmother had a lifetime, and she spent it hiding. The words came out harder than she intended. She kept them. I'm not doing that. The silence stretched between them. Then Damien said, We go in together. You follow my lead until I give you room. When I give you room, you take it. Nothing improvised without cause. Agreed. If it goes wrong, then it goes wrong and we deal with it. She looked at him. That's how it works, isn't it? You deal with it. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face she still couldn't name. Something that had been building over 4 days of arguments and midnight questions, and the particular proximity of people who have been thrown into the same dangerous situation and have found, to their mutual inconvenience, that they can bear each other's company better than expected. Yes, he said quietly, that's how it works. The Meridian Hotel meeting was set, and that night, alone in the room that was not her room, in the building that was not her life, wearing her 3rd day in the same clothes because she'd refused to let Marco's people buy her anything, Celine lay awake and thought about what her grandmother had carried for 30 years and what it had cost her. The silence, the smallness, the careful, invisible life, and felt something harden in her chest like setting concrete. She was still thinking about it at 2 a.m. when she heard the alert. It wasn't loud. A subtle change in the building's ambient sound, something in the security system, some shift in the electronic environment that she wouldn't have noticed 3 days ago but had been learning to read. She heard it and went to the door, and Marco was already in the corridor, moving fast, his hand inside his jacket. What is it? She said. Someone ran the service elevator to 43. His voice was low and clipped. It stopped there, unauthorized. Moretti? Too soon, too direct. But he was already moving. Get your brother. Lock the room. She got Noah. She locked the room. She stood with her back against the door, and her brother beside her and his hand finding hers in the dark, the way it had when they were children and thunder rolled over Queens. And she thought, too direct for Moretti means it's someone else. Someone inside. And then the fire alarm began to scream through the building, and through the locked door she heard the sound of running feet, and the crack of something breaking, and Damien's voice saying a single flat. The word Damien said was a name. She heard it through the locked door. One syllable, hard and flat, the way you say a name when the person attached to it has just done something unforgivable. Then the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Then voices she didn't recognize, fast and overlapping. Then another sound she did recognize because she'd heard it in enough action films to know what it was, even without having been close to one in her actual life. A gunshot. Noah's hand tightened on hers. Don't move, she said. Don't say anything either. She pressed her ear against the door. The fire alarm was still going, that flat mechanical scream filling everything, designed to prevent exactly the kind of listening she was trying to do. Underneath it she could hear movement. Multiple people, not the organized efficiency of Damien's security team, but something more urgent, something with the irregular rhythm of a situation that wasn't going according to plan. Her plan, specifically. The one that didn't exist yet. The one she was trying to construct in real time with her ear against a locked door and her brother's hand in hers and 47 floors of Chicago between her and the ground. Another shot, closer. Then Damien's voice again. Not a name this time. An order. Something short and absolute that she couldn't make out through the alarm. Then, nothing. The alarm cut off at the same moment, and the silence it left behind was the particular deafening kind that follows sustained noise. A silence with texture and weight. Celine heard her own breathing, heard Noah beside her, heard the city outside the windows, indifferent as always. 3 knocks on the door, then 2, then 1. Marco's signal. He'd established it on the second night without explanation, and she'd memorized it because memorizing things that might matter had become instinctive in the last 4 days. She unlocked the door. Marco came in and closed it behind him. He had blood on his right sleeve. Not his, she thought, from the way he was moving. And his face had the careful blankness of someone who was managing their own response to something in order to stay functional. "Are you both uninjured?" he said. "Yes." "What happened?" Someone came up the service elevator. One person, armed. He looked at her with those measuring eyes. He wasn't Moretti's. "Then whose?" Marco was quiet for 1 second too long. Marco. "We need to move you to the secondary location. Damien's orders. I'll explain in the car." "You'll explain now." Celine. His voice carried something she hadn't heard in it before. Not urgency, but urgency she'd heard. This was something more careful, something that was choosing its words. "There are things I need to confirm before I tell you what I think happened. If I'm wrong, I've created a problem that doesn't need to exist. If I'm right..." He stopped. In the car, 20 minutes. She looked at him for a moment. She had 4 days of reading this man's face, 4 days of watching him watch her, and what she saw now was not deception. It was the expression of someone who had discovered something that was going to hurt someone they had decided, against their professional instincts, to care about. "Fine," she said. "Where's Damien?" "He'll meet us at the secondary location." "Is he hurt?" "He's operational," Marco said, which was not the same as no, but was the only answer she was going to get. The secondary location was a building in River North that looked, from the outside, like every other mixed-use development in that part of the city. Glass and steel, and the vague suggestion of expensive apartments above commercial space. The inside was different. The inside was a series of rooms that had been configured with the same deliberate purpose as the penthouse's northeast office, but without the penthouse's gestures toward habitation. This was a place for working, not for living. Damien was there when they arrived. He was standing at a sink in the small kitchen off the main room, washing his hands with the focused attention of someone who needed something to do with their hands. There was a cut along his left jaw, shallow, already clotting, and the way he held his right shoulder told her the old injury was registering in the cold. He turned when he heard them come in, and his eyes went to her first, then to Noah, and something in his face released a fraction. "Sit," he said to Noah. "I'm fine standing." "Sit down, please. You look like you're about to fall over." Noah, who did in fact look like he was about to fall over, sat down. Damien looked at Celine. She looked back at him, the cut on his jaw, the shoulder, the hands he'd dried on a towel, and was now holding at his sides with the deliberate stillness of someone managing pain they weren't going to mention. "The man in the elevator," she said. "He's alive, barely." "Did he talk?" "Enough." He moved to the main table and sat and looked at Marco. Something passed between them. A communication she was starting to be able to read. The compressed language of 2 people who had worked together for a long time in situations that required fast understanding. Marco nodded once and left the room. Damien looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. "The man in the elevator worked for me," he said. The room was quiet. "Worked," she said. "Past tense, yes. He worked for you, and he came up the service elevator with a weapon. He came up the service elevator with a weapon and a specific target." Damien's voice was even. The evenness was costing him something. She could hear the cost of it. "He wasn't sent by Moretti. He was sent by someone inside my organization who has been communicating with Moretti for at least 6 weeks. He paused. Someone who understood that an alliance between the Russo network and a restored Veil claim would be the single largest threat to Moretti's position in 30 years. Someone who decided to prevent that alliance before it could be formalized. "By killing me," Celine said. "By removing the reason for the alliance." He looked at her steadily. Yes. She processed that. She let it sit in her chest and felt the weight of it. Not panic, not the dramatic shock she might have expected from herself, just the flat, heavy recognition of what it meant. Someone inside his organization, someone close enough to know about her, close enough to know about the meeting with Moretti, close enough to have been watching the shape of the last 4 days from the inside. How many people knew I was here, she said. In full? 4, including Marco and myself. He paused. In partial, my schedule, the security rotation, the movements in and out of the building over the last 4 days, perhaps a dozen. You have a traitor in a dozen-person circle. It would appear so. And you don't know who. Something moved through his expression, not uncertainty. Damien didn't do uncertainty, or at least he didn't show it. This was something more specific, something that looked like a man standing at the edge of a conclusion he didn't want to reach. I have a suspicion, he said. Tell me. Not yet. Damien, not yet. The words were quiet and absolute. Because if I'm wrong, I will have destroyed something I can't rebuild. And if I'm right, I need to be certain before I act, because acting on this wrong would be worse than the alternative. She stared at him. Someone just tried to have me killed. I know. Inside your building. Inside your security perimeter. With your own person. I know. And you're asking me to wait while you decide whether you're certain enough to tell me who you think did it. I'm asking you to give me 12 hours. He met her eyes. 12 hours and I'll know. I'll tell you everything I know, and then we'll decide together what comes next. The word together sat strangely in the room. She noticed it. She thought he noticed her noticing it. She looked at him for a long moment. His jaw, his shoulder, his hands on the table. Still, controlled, giving nothing away except to someone who had spent 4 days learning to read the small things. 12 hours, she said. He nodded. Marco came back into the room with a laptop and a phone, and the expression of a man who had confirmed something he didn't want to have confirmed. He set both on the table and looked at Damien without speaking. Damien looked at the phone. His jaw tightened once, visibly, and then was still. Leave us, he said to Marco. Damien, leave us. Marco looked at Celine once, that same measuring expression, this time carrying something that looked like an apology, or the shape of one. And then he left. Damien turned the phone to face her. It was a photograph, taken in low light, slightly blurred, the kind of image that comes from a distance or from a concealed position. 2 men at a restaurant table. One of them was Lucian Moretti. She recognized him now, the silver hair, the precise face. The other was a younger man, dark-haired, somewhere in his late 30s, with a lean build and the kind of self-possession that photographs usually, and the way he was leaning across the table toward Moretti had the quality of someone receiving instructions. Who is that? Celine said. Damien was quiet for a moment that she felt in her teeth. His name is Ren Vassetti, Damien said. He's been with my organization for 11 years. He runs our financial operations in the city. A pause. He also grew up 3 streets from the Moretti family compound in New Jersey. I knew that. I knew that when I brought him in. I considered it and determined it was manageable. Another pause, this one longer. I was wrong. When was this photograph taken? 3 weeks ago. She looked at him. You've had this for 3 weeks. I received it this morning, from a source I trust, who received it 6 days ago and spent 3 days verifying its authenticity before sending it. His voice was still even, still costing him. If I'd had it 6 days ago, the man in the elevator doesn't come through the elevator. But I didn't, and he did. Celine sat back in her chair. She thought about the last 4 days, about the information she'd absorbed, about the things she'd said in rooms she thought were secure, about the Meridian Hotel meeting, the one that Damien had agreed to, that she had argued for, that she had been anticipating with something that embarrassed her to examine closely. Does Moretti know about the meeting? She said. Ren Vassetti knows about the meeting. So yes. Which means the meeting is a trap. The meeting was always a potential trap. Now it's a confirmed one. He looked at her. Moretti will expect us to cancel. He'll expect that the attempt on your life tonight confirmed his reach and will pull us back. A pause. He'll recalibrate for a longer-term approach while he waits for us to make a mistake from a position of fear. Unless we don't cancel, she said. I'm not taking you into a confirmed trap. It's only a trap if we walk in as targets. She could hear her own voice changing, something in the register of it, the pace. Something that had been building over 4 days of fighting and learning and not sleeping was finding its edge. If we walk in knowing what he knows, knowing what he's prepared, knowing that Vassetti has been feeding him information, it's still a trap. It's a trap we can see. That's different. She put both hands flat on the table. Damien, he thinks I'm frightened. He thinks you're reactive right now because someone came into your building and nearly reached a woman you've been protecting. He thinks the variable in his plan worked. She paused. It didn't work. He looked at her. You're alive, he said. I'm alive and I'm angry and I know more than he thinks I know. That's a different woman than the one he's expecting. She held his gaze. Let me be that woman in that room. Something moved across his face, the same expression she'd caught fragments of over the last 4 days. The one she still couldn't fully name, that lived somewhere in the vicinity of recognition and resistance, and something underneath both of those things that she was fairly certain he was working hard to keep below the surface. You said you'd give me 12 hours, he said. I'm not going anywhere. I mean sleep, both of you. He glanced at Noah, who had fallen asleep in the chair in the corner with his head against the wall and his mouth slightly open, looking about 15 years old. Your brother is running on nothing. So are you. She looked at Noah, felt the familiar pull of protective attention, the calculation of his color, his breathing, the subtle signs she'd learned to read over years of managing his health alongside everything else. He needs his medication at 7, she said. Marco has it. He needs food when he takes it, not after, during. I'll make sure. She looked at Damien. You won't sleep. I'll sleep when this is done. That's not... I know, he said. Go. She went. She lay in the dark of the small room at the back of the River North building and stared at the ceiling and thought about Ren Vassetti, thought about 11 years, the weight of that number, the depth of access it implied. Every decision Damien had made in 11 years that Vassetti had been present for or proximate to or informed about afterward. Every operation, every alliance, every vulnerability. She thought about her grandmother, about 30 years of a different kind of hiding, the hiding of a woman who had watched her entire family burn and decided that survival required becoming invisible, who had brought a child into that invisibility and then a grandchild, layering the protection of ordinariness over a name that had once meant something, a bloodline that had once commanded rooms, who had taught her a song she didn't explain, who had, Celine was beginning to understand, prepared her without ever using the word prepared. She slept at some point. Not much. Not deeply. The morning came gray through the small window, and with it, the sound of Damien's voice from the main room, low and controlled and very cold in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Not in 4 days of watching him manage dangerous information. She dressed quickly and came into the main room. Damien was on the phone. Marco stood near him with his arms crossed and his jaw set. A third man was in the room. Someone she hadn't seen before, mid-40s, dark coat, with the posture of someone who delivered information for a living and was currently delivering information that was not going well. Damien saw her. He held up one hand. Wait. And finished the call and ended it and set the phone down very carefully, with the specific care of a man who was choosing not to throw it. Tell me, she said. He looked at the third man. The third man looked at Celine with a brief assessment and then looked at Damien, deferring. Vassetti moved last night, Damien said, while we were dealing with the elevator situation. He accessed financial reserves, operational funds for 3 ongoing projects, and transferred them through 4 intermediary accounts. The transfers cleared at 2 in the morning. He paused. He's gone. Gone. His apartment, his office, his car. He planned this with the elevator. The attempt on your life was designed to create enough chaos for the financial operation to go unnoticed until he was outside our reach. Celine looked at him. How much? Enough to fund Moretti's operation for 6 months of direct conflict. His voice was absolutely flat. And enough to demonstrate to every family watching that a significant portion of my organization just walked out the door. He paused. In this world, money moving is a message. Everyone who needs to know will know by the end of the day. She understood what that meant. She'd had 4 days of understanding how this world worked, and she understood it now in her gut, not just her head. The signal this sent, the vulnerability it exposed, the way it would look to the men who were deciding whether the Russo-Vale alliance was something to align with or something to wait out. The Meridian meeting, she said. Moretti will have heard about Vassetti's departure before we walk in the door, which means he'll expect us to come in diminished, which means we'll be walking in diminished. He said it without softness. Celine, what happened last night and this morning? This is what actual damage looks like. Not a story, not a lesson. Vassetti's departure is going to pull at 3 other relationships in my organization that were already under tension. Moretti knows which threads to pull. He looked at her directly. I need you to understand that the situation has changed significantly. I understand it, she said. Understanding it includes the possibility that the meeting tomorrow is a room I shouldn't take you into. Understanding it, she said, includes the fact that if we don't walk into that room tomorrow, Moretti wins this round without a fight, and the families watching decide that the Vale claim is noise. She crossed her arms. You told me first impressions in this world calcify. That's true. What calcifies tomorrow in that room is either that we're reactive and frightened or that we're not. She held his gaze. I am not going to be the reason we don't walk in. You're not the reason. Vassetti is the reason. Vassetti is the reason we walk in with less than we planned. He is not the reason we don't walk in at all. She could hear the edge in her own voice, the anger that had been compressing for 4 days, since the moment she'd learned what her grandmother had carried, since the moment she'd understood what had been taken from her family before she was born, since the moment someone had sent a man up a service elevator to end her claim before she'd had a chance to make it. These people killed my family. They erased my name. They made my grandmother into a ghost and made me into a woman who cleans their windows and doesn't know who she is. Her voice didn't break. It hardened. I am not walking away from that room. Damien looked at her for a long time. Then he said, we need to change the approach entirely. Tell me. The original plan was to present a unified front, Russo resources, Vale legitimacy, a formal claim backed by sufficient force to make Moretti's cost-benefit analysis fall in our favor. He moved to the table and picked up a pen and looked at it without writing anything. That plan assumed we were walking in with full operational strength. We're not. So what do we walk in with? Something Moretti won't have prepared for. He set the pen down. You, specifically. Not as the woman I'm protecting. Not as the heir I'm presenting. He looked at her, as the claimant who doesn't need me to speak for her. She felt the weight of what he was describing settle on her. You want me to run the meeting. I want you to run the meeting. I've had 4 days. You've had 4 days and you're already asking questions I don't have complete answers to. He echoed his own words from 3 nights ago, without apparently noticing he was doing it. Moretti is going to walk into that room expecting a frightened woman and a weakened man. The weakened man is accurate. I'm not going to pretend Vassetti's departure doesn't cost us, but the frightened woman is where he's wrong. He paused. That's the gap. That's what we have. She thought about her grandmother's hands, the efficiency of them, the absence of wasted motion. She thought about 30 years of invisible life. She thought about Noah in the chair last night with his mouth open, and his 2 large joints and his body that had been fighting something for so long that winning was no longer the point. What do I need to know before tomorrow? She said. They worked through the night, not the slow, methodical education of the previous 4 days, but something faster and more urgent, drilling specific scenarios, specific responses. The particular geography of negotiation that Damien mapped for her with the efficiency of a man who understood that time was the only resource they had left in adequate supply. He pushed her harder than he had before. She pushed back harder. They argued twice in ways that were genuinely angry, genuinely heated, and both times landed somewhere more useful than where they'd started. At 4 in the morning, Marco brought food nobody asked for, and everyone ate without commenting on it. At 5, Noah came into the main room in his socks and looked at the two of them across the table and said, "You haven't slept." "We're working," Celine said. "You look terrible." "Thank you, Noah." He sat down and looked at the papers on the table. He looked at Damien. Damien looked back at him with the expression of a man who was extremely tired and had no patience for anything that wasn't immediately relevant. "She's going to be okay," Noah said. To Damien. Not as a question. Damien was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to make sure of it," he said. Noah looked at him for another moment with that fast-reading gaze that was their grandmother's gaze, the one Selene saw in the mirror sometimes and didn't fully recognize as her own. "Okay," Noah said, and went back to his room. Dawn came. At 7:30, Marco came in from outside with the expression of a man who had just received confirmation of something he'd been tracking. "Vassetti surfaced," he said. "Miami. He's with Moretti's people." Damien nodded once. He'd expected it. "And there's something else," Marco said. He looked at Celine when he said it, that apology shape in his expression again, more defined this time. "The contact who sent the photograph of Vassetti and Moretti." He paused. "She asked me to tell you something. She said—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "She said that your grandmother knew what she was giving you. She said Elda Vale made a choice 30 years ago to survive instead of disappear, and that there's a difference between those two things. That surviving means you intend to come back." He paused again. "She said Elda talked about you, to this contact, in the last year before she died." His voice was careful. "She said Elda knew you would be the one to finish it." The room was very quiet. Celine looked at the window, at the gray Chicago morning, at the city that had never looked like somewhere she belonged and was beginning to look like something else. Not belonging, exactly. Something more demanding than belonging. "Who is the contact?" she said. "Her name is Celia Morrow," Marco said. "She was your grandmother's closest friend for 20 years. She's been waiting for someone to surface with the right information." He paused. "She wants to meet you. After the meridian." After the meridian. As though it were simply a scheduled appointment. As though walking into a room with the man who had ordered her family's execution were a thing that happened and was followed by other things that happened. Celine looked at Damien. He was watching her with the expression she still couldn't entirely name. The one that had been building for 4 days and was clearer now than it had been, but still resisted the word she kept reaching for. "The meeting is at 2, he said. "I know. Are you ready?" She thought about that. Not the question. She knew what the question was. She thought about the honest answer, which was that she didn't know what ready meant in this context, that nothing in her life had prepared her for this room, that she had 4 days in her grandmother's hands, and a song she'd been singing since she was 4 years old without understanding what it... She was ready. Not in the way she'd imagined readiness would feel. Not calm, not certain, not arrived at some elevated state of preparation that made the fear disappear. The fear was still there. It was in her sternum, a specific pressure, like something had lodged itself between her ribs and was expanding slowly. Her hands were steady, but her pulse was not, and she'd stopped pretending otherwise sometime around 9 in the morning when she'd looked at herself in the small bathroom mirror of the River North building and understood that the woman looking back at her was not the woman who had cleaned Damien Russo's windows 5 days ago. She was wearing borrowed clothes. Marco had arranged them, a dark blouse, charcoal trousers, a jacket that fit well enough. No jewelry except small, plain earrings. She'd looked at herself in the mirror and thought, this is what the beginning of a performance looks like. Then she'd thought, it's not a performance if you mean it. She meant it. At 12:30, they went over everything one last time. Damien, Marco, Celine at the table in the main room, the Meridian Hotel layout, the room Moretti had selected, a private dining room on the 4th floor that the hotel offered for business meetings, accessible from 2 directions, with staff access through a 3rd. Marco's people had been in the building since 10. 2 of Moretti's people had been in the building since 8, which was expected. There were also 2 people Marco couldn't account for who had checked into rooms on the 4th floor yesterday afternoon, which was less expected. He's adding coverage, Marco said. He doesn't trust the meeting either, Damien said. Neither do we, Celine said. She was thinking about the room, about what the room would feel like, the temperature of it, the arrangement, the specific geography of two people sitting across from each other with decades of violence between them and a table pretending to be neutral ground. She was thinking about Lucian Moretti's face in the photograph, the precision of it, the patience. She was thinking about what Damien had told her about patience, how it was Moretti's primary weapon, the capacity to wait longer than his opponents were comfortable waiting, to let silence do work that other men used aggression for. She intended to use his patience against him. When we walk in, she said, I go first. Damien looked at her. Not ahead of you, she said, but I'm not walking in behind you. We enter together, equal footing. He needs to see that from the first second. Agreed. And when we sit, I want to be the one who speaks first, not you. Marco shifted slightly. Damien didn't. The first thing Moretti says will be designed to establish his position, Damien said. He'll make a show of addressing me, implicitly reducing you. I know. If you respond before he's finished, I'm not going to interrupt him. I'm going to wait. I'm going to let him finish his show, and then I'm going to speak before you do. She looked at Damien steadily. He expects a woman who needs you to speak for her. We've already agreed on that. So the most destabilizing thing I can do in that room in the first 30 seconds is be someone he didn't prepare for. Damien was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. They left the building at 1:15. The car was black and quiet, and the city outside the windows had the bright, hard quality of a November afternoon, all sharp light and cold. Celine sat in the back beside Damien and watched Chicago move past and tried to find the right register for what was happening inside her. Something that wasn't panic, wasn't bravado, was something more honest and more useful than either. What she found was anger, clean and specific. The kind of anger that doesn't lose itself in heat but compresses into something with edges. Her grandmother had been afraid for 30 years. She was not going to be afraid for 30 years. Damien's hand was close to hers on the seat, not touching. She was aware of the distance. If it goes wrong, he said quietly. It won't. If it does. She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, at the back of the driver's seat, his jaw set. The cut from last night, a thin dark line below his cheekbone. Marco gets Noah out, she said. That was already the plan. Yes. And you and I deal with what's in front of us. He turned and looked at her. This close, in the flat afternoon light, his eyes were more complex than deep water. There were things in them she'd been catching fragments of for 5 days, and was only now, in the back of a car on the way to something that could go several wrong directions, beginning to read clearly. I need to tell you something, he said. Now? I should have said it before. He paused. The pause had weight to it. She felt the weight. What I'm doing with you. What I've been. The alliance, the strategy, the restoration of the Vale name. He stopped. Say it. It stopped being purely strategic 3 days ago. He said it flatly, like a report, like a man delivering information he'd verified and could no longer justify withholding. That's a liability in what we're about to do, and you should know it, because it changes how I'll react if something goes wrong in that room. She looked at him. How does it change how you'll react? I'll prioritize you over the outcome. Don't. I know. Damien, don't. If you pull back from the objective because you're worried about me, we lose everything we've... I know, he said again. I'm not saying I'll act on it. I'm saying you should know it exists so you can account for it. His jaw tightened. You asked me to be honest with you from the beginning. She looked at him for a moment that was longer than it should have been given what they were driving toward. After, she said. We deal with that after. Something in his face shifted. Not relief. Something more complex and more guarded than relief. An acknowledgement. After, he said. The Meridian Hotel was a study in surfaces, marble and brass, and the kind of lighting that made everyone look slightly more significant than they were. They came through the side entrance, bypassing the lobby. Marco's earpiece clicked twice as they entered the elevator. 2 clicks back. Everything in position, 4th floor. The corridor was carpeted in something dark and thick that swallowed footsteps. The private dining room was at the end, its door closed. Two of Marco's men stood at positions that looked casual and were not. Celine could feel the building's awareness of itself, the held breath of it, the way spaces feel when too many people in them know something is about to happen. She breathed, in through the nose, slow, feeling the expansion in her chest. Her mother's name was Lucia. Her grandfather's name was Enzo. Her great-grandmother had sung this song to her daughter, who sang it to her daughter, who sang it to a woman who was about to walk into a room and claim 30 years of debt. She breathed out. Damien opened the door. The room was smaller than she'd imagined, which she immediately understood was a deliberate choice on Moretti's part. Smaller rooms reduced the performance space, made everything more intimate, more pressured. Round table, 6 chairs, 3 on each side. Lucian Moretti was already seated, which was also a deliberate choice. He'd arrived first to be settled and in position when they entered, to force them to come to him. He was smaller than photographs suggested. Most powerful people were. The silver hair was accurate, thick, precisely combed, the vanity of a man who had never stopped caring about his appearance, because appearance was part of the message. He wore a charcoal suit with a pale blue tie, and he sat with the stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms like this one and had made peace with the waiting. 2 men stood behind him, large, still, expensive suits. One of them had the specific kind of stillness that meant his hand was near something he could reach quickly. Moretti looked at Damien when they entered. Then he looked at Celine. Something crossed his face, so fast she almost missed it, but she was watching for it, had been briefed to watch for it. The involuntary recognition of someone encountering something they expected to be manageable and discovering it might not be. "Damien?" Moretti said. His voice was low and precise, Italian lilt worn almost entirely smooth by decades of American English. "I heard you had an eventful night." He was establishing his position, showing that he knew about the elevator, showing that Vassetti's information had reached him, that he knew Damien's organization had a wound. He said it pleasantly, with the smile of a man delivering news that he'd known before it happened. Celine and Damien sat. Celine sat first. She placed her hands flat on the table and looked at Lucian Moretti directly and said, "You ordered the execution of 9 members of my family in a harbor house outside Palermo in 1994. You used their deaths to seize territorial assets that weren't yours and built 30 years of power on an architecture of lies. I'm here to discuss the terms of your acknowledgement of that." The room went very still. Moretti looked at her. The smile was still technically present on his face, but it had evacuated its content. It was just shape now. Just the arrangement of muscles that hadn't caught up with what was happening behind his eyes. "You must be the Vale girl," he said. "I'm Celine Vale." She didn't blink. "Yes." He looked at Damien. "You brought her to speak." "She speaks for herself," Damien said. Moretti looked back at her. His hands were folded on the table. His posture was unchanged, but she could see the recalibration happening. Could see him adjusting his read of the room, updating his expectation, running through his prepared responses, and finding that they didn't quite fit what was sitting across from him. "Good. You've had 5 days, Moretti said to her. Not unkindly, the voice of a man humoring something. 5 days with Damien Rousseau's version of your family history. You understand that's a particular kind of education. It's the same education you gave me by sending a man up a service elevator last night, she said. That told me everything I needed to know about how seriously you take my existence. Something flickered in his eyes. That wasn't my... It was coordinated by a man you met 3 weeks ago in a restaurant in the West Loop and have been running as an asset inside Damien's organization for at least 6 weeks. She watched his face. She watched it the way Damien had taught her to watch faces. Not for the obvious reactions, but for the small ones, the ones that lived in the eyes and the corners of the mouth and the almost imperceptible shift of weight in the shoulders. The transfer cleared at 2 a.m. That's precise timing. That's not an improvised operation. You planned this before you proposed this meeting. She paused. Which means you knew about me before last week. The smile was gone now. You've been tracking the Vale bloodline, she said. For how long? Moretti was quiet for 4 seconds. She counted them. You're not what I expected, he said. I know. Damien. He shifted his gaze. Where did you find her? She found herself, Damien said. I just paid attention. Moretti looked at his folded hands, then back at Celine. The recalibration was complete now. She could see it, the settlement of his assessment, the arrival at a new position. He was no longer looking at her like a variable to be managed. He was looking at her like a problem that had become interesting, that was more dangerous. What do you want? He said to her. Recognition of the Vale bloodline and its claim to the Sicilian assets seized after 1994. She said it cleanly. Formal acknowledgement before the relevant parties that the massacre was an unauthorized act that violated the established agreements of the time. She paused. Financial reparations structured over 4 years at a rate we'll negotiate today, and the return of the Palermo property. Moretti's eyebrow moved a fraction. The Palermo property. The harbor house was rebuilt. My family's name was removed from the deed through a fraudulent transfer 9 months after the massacre. The current owner is a holding company with 3 layers of incorporation that traces back to a subsidiary of your Eastern operations. She held his gaze. We want it back. That property is worth I know what it's worth. Silence. One of the men behind Moretti shifted his weight. The man on the right, she noted. The one whose hand was near something reachable. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Moretti. And if I decline, Moretti said, then the documentation of the 1994 operation, the planning, the authorization, the asset transfers, the names of every participant still living, gets distributed to every family that was operating in those territories at the time, and to 3 federal investigators who have been building cases against your Northeastern network for the last 8 years. She paused. You've been careful for 30 years. One document release won't destroy you, but it will cost you the relationships you've been maintaining with families who believe you've been operating within the old agreements, families who don't know what you did. Another pause. And it will start a conversation about what else you've done that people don't know about yet. Moretti looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Damien. She's been here 5 days, he said. It wasn't quite disbelief. It was something more complicated. 4, Damien said. Moretti almost smiled. Not the diplomatic kind, something more genuine and more unsettling. Where was this documentation before last week? My grandmother kept it, Celine said. 30 years. In a safe deposit box in a Queens bank under a name that died with her. Her lawyer had instructions. She paused. She was surviving, not disappearing. There's a difference. Something moved through Moretti's face at that. Something she couldn't read. Something that lived in a more private register than anything else he'd shown in this room. Whether it was respect or grief, or the particular sensation of a plan encountering its own incompleteness, she couldn't say. I'll need time to... he started. The door opened. Not the main door. The staff access. The third entry point that Marco had noted in the layout. It opened fast, without a knock, and the man who came through it was not hotel staff. He was 30, broad, with the particular focus of someone operating on instruction, and he had a weapon visible at his hip that he was not reaching for yet, but that everyone in the room immediately understood was the point. He looked at Moretti. Moretti's expression didn't change. Sit down, the man said to Celine. She was already sitting. Don't move, he corrected. Behind her, she heard Damien's chair scrape, the sound of a man starting to stand. And then she heard the sound of the door behind them opening too, the main door. And when she turned her head, she saw 2 more men coming in and Marco's voice in the corridor saying something that cut off very suddenly and wrong. Her heart was going, not racing, slamming, each beat distinct and heavy in her sternum. She could feel her own pulse in her hands where they were flat on the table, and she did not move them because moving hands in a room with multiple visible weapons was a specific kind of provocation she'd been warned about. She looked at Moretti. His expression was careful and still and gave her nothing. I want to be clear, he said, that this is not the outcome I preferred. Then stop it, she said. I'm afraid the situation has moved beyond. You're afraid, she said, and the word came out hot and precise and more controlled than she felt. That a 26-year-old woman from Queens walked into your room with documentation you spent 30 years thinking was destroyed in terms you weren't prepared for, and now you don't know what to do. She felt the anger she'd been compressing since the car finding its sharpest edge. You planned this meeting as an exit. You were going to confirm what you knew and then remove the problem. She looked at him. I'm telling you, the problem doesn't remove cleanly. My grandmother made sure of that. She made very sure of that. The documentation, Moretti said, is not here, is not in any location connected to me or to Damien's organization, is held by two people whose names I'm not going to tell you, and who have instructions that are already in motion if I don't make a specific call by 4 o'clock. She watched his face. It's 1:50 now. The man by the staff door had his hand on his weapon. Damien was very still behind her. She could feel his stillness, the quality of it, the cost of it, the effort of a man who had told her 30 minutes ago that he would prioritize her over the outcome, and was currently choosing not to. One of the men behind Moretti leaned down and murmured something at his ear. Moretti listened. His expression didn't change. He nodded once, barely. The man straightened. The documentation, Moretti said again, slowly. If it exists the way you describe it, the distribution you described would not only cost me relationships, it would also expose certain operations that involved families who are currently in alliance with Damien. He paused. It would be mutually destructive. Most things that matter are, she said. You'd burn your own potential alliances to tea. I'd light the match myself if it meant every family in this network understood what you did in 1994. Her voice was flat. My grandmother survived 30 years watching the man who killed her family operate without consequence. I've had 4 days to feel what that costs. 30 years of it would have killed me. She leaned forward slightly. I will burn everything to the ground before I let you walk out of this room thinking you can wait me out. Moretti looked at her. For the first time in the meeting, he looked at her not as a problem or a variable or an unexpected complication. He looked at her the way the old men in Damien's story had looked at her grandmother, like something from the past arriving in the present, something they thought was finished that had turned out to be very much ongoing. The men by the doors, Damien said from behind her. His voice was quiet and very cold. Tell them to stand down. Moretti didn't move. I have 4 people in this building who are currently holding positions on your 2 unaccounted rooms, Damien said. Whatever instruction those rooms are waiting for, they won't receive it. The question is whether we have a conversation or whether we have a situation, and the situation ends worse for everyone, but particularly for you. Celine watched Moretti's face. She watched him do the calculation. She could almost see it. The weighing of variables, the assessment of what was real and what was performance. The 71-year-old patience of a man who had survived by reading rooms correctly, deciding whether this was a room he was reading correctly. The man by the staff door didn't move. Moretti's eyes went from Damien to Celine and back to Damien and then settled on Celine. 4 years is too long for the reparations structure, he said. The room shifted. Not physically, in the air, in the weight of it. The weapon by the staff door lost its imminence. The men behind Moretti remained standing, but their quality changed, from operational to present. 6 years is too long, she said. We'll discuss the structure. The principle is non-negotiable. The Palermo property is non-negotiable. His jaw moved. Not a clench, a compression. Controlled. The public acknowledgement you described. Before the relevant parties, not public in the press. We're not interested in media. We're interested in the network understanding what happened. She paused. The families who remember 1994 deserve to know what it actually was. Moretti was quiet. Then, slowly, he unfolded his hands on the table and placed them flat, a gesture that mirrored hers, she realized. Whether it was conscious or not, she couldn't say. You'll want this in writing, he said, before we leave this room. I don't carry Marco, Damien said. Marco came through the main door, operational, unhurt, which meant the sound she'd heard in the corridor had been managed. He carried a folder. He set it on the table without comment and stepped back. Moretti looked at the folder. He looked at Celine. 30 years, he said, something in his voice that might, in a different man, have been close to admission. Your grandmother was more dangerous than anyone gave her credit for. Yes, Celine said. She was. He reached for the folder. And that was when the window exploded. Not both windows. The one on the east wall, the one that looked out over the hotel's interior courtyard, the one that Marco's sweep had cleared that morning. The glass came inward in a fast, bright cascade, and the sound was enormous. A single compressed detonation that rang through Celine's skull and chest simultaneously. And then the room was full of shouting and the sharp, specific smell of a flashbang's aftermath, and the overhead lights went out. Darkness. For 3 seconds. Complete. Then the emergency lighting kicked in, dim and red and casting everything in the flat color of damage. One of Moretti's men was on the ground. The other was moving toward the staff door. Moretti himself was behind the table, down and behind it, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had survived this kind of thing before. Damien had Celine by the arm. "Move," he said. "The folder. Leave it. No." She pulled against his grip. Not enough to break it, enough to make a point, and grabbed the folder from the table and then let him pull her toward the main door. Marco was ahead of them, weapon drawn, the corridor outside lit by emergency lights, and empty, except for one of Marco's people who had the specific look of someone managing an injury and continuing anyway. Shouting from the east end of the corridor, Damien pushed her ahead of him through the emergency exit. The stairwell was concrete and cold, and they went down fast. Celine's hand on the railing and the folder pressed against her chest and her pulse enormous in her ears. Behind her she could hear Damien's breathing, controlled, slightly labored, and she thought of his shoulder, thought of the cost of the pace, said nothing. Second floor landing. Marco stopped them. "Northeast exit is covered," he said. "Quiet. Fast." Someone had people on the exterior. This wasn't Moretti. Celine heard that, processed it. Not Moretti. "Vassetti," Damien said. "Has to be. Moretti's people are as contained as ours right now. This was a third party with advanced positioning." Marco looked at Damien. "They knew the location. Vassetti gave it to them. Or sold it." Damien's hand was on her shoulder. She could feel the tension in it. The specific tension of a man who was calculating fast in a situation that was moving faster than the calculation. "Southwest exit," Marco said. "2 cars on Wabash. We move now." They moved. The ground floor was staff corridors and kitchen service halls, and the muffled sounds of hotel operations that hadn't registered the situation yet. They moved through them fast and wrong, against the flow, against the logic of the space. Marco ahead, clearing each turn, and Damien behind Celine, and her hand still pressing the folder against her chest. Because the folder was the point. The folder was what they'd come for. The folder was Moretti's signature on a principle, even if the specifics weren't finalized yet. She heard a shout behind them, then running feet. Then Damien said, "Go," in a voice she'd never heard from him before. Not controlled, not cold, and she went. The southwest exit was a fire door onto a service alley off Wabash, and the November air hit her like a wall, brutal and immediate after the heated interior. One of Marco's cars was there. The driver had the engine running. Marco went in first, Celine second, and she was sliding across the seat when she heard the shot. Not inside the hotel. In the alley. She turned. Damien was still in the doorway. He was upright. She registered that first, the relief of it, but his left hand was against the door frame and his right hand was pressed against his side, and the white of his shirt at the ribs was dark and getting darker in the emergency light spilling from the doorway. "Damien," she said. He pushed off the door frame and got to the car and dropped into the seat, and Marco said something to the driver, and the car moved, and Celine had her hand on his side before she'd made the decision to move it, pressing against the dark fabric and feeling the wet warmth of it beneath her palm. "It's not," he started. "Stop talking." "It's not." I said, "Stop." Her voice came out like something with teeth. She pressed harder. He made a sound that he immediately compressed into silence. She kept the pressure. "How bad?" "Manageable." "That's not manageable," he said again, and the word had the specific quality of a man who had decided something and was not entertaining alternative. The hospital was a private facility on the north side that Marco called by a name she didn't recognize, and that didn't appear on any public directory she would ever be able to find. The kind of place that existed for people whose injuries required discretion alongside medicine. The kind of place that didn't ask questions about how a man had come to have a bullet lodged in the tissue between his 8th and 9th ribs on the right side. Celine sat in a corridor outside a closed door and pressed her back against the wall and breathed. The folder was in her lap. She'd been holding it since the meridian. Her palm had left a slight impression in the cardstock cover where she'd gripped it in the car. She noticed this the way you notice small, precise things when your mind is managing something too large to approach directly. She smoothed the impression with her thumb. It didn't smooth out. Marco came out of the room and closed the door behind him. "He's stable," he said. She nodded. "The round didn't... It missed the critical structures. The doctor says he was lucky in the specific way that lucky means it was bad, but not worst." He paused. "He'll be in there for a while." "I know." Marco sat down in the chair across from her. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not the managed fatigue of someone running on adrenaline and professionalism, but the genuine tiredness of a man who had spent a very long day being worried about someone he cared about and was only now allowing himself to feel the weight of that. "The folder," he said. She looked down at it. "Moretti signed the preliminary acknowledgement before the window came in," she said. "The structure isn't finalized. The specifics are not finalized. But the principal is there with his signature and 2 witnesses, and that's enough to take to the families." She paused. "If we can take it to the families before he decides the chaos gives him room to retract." "How long do we have?" "Hours? Maybe less." Marco looked at the folder. "You understand that what happened in that room, what you did in that room, is already moving through the network," he said. "My people were in the building. They saw. Information travels." He paused. "By tonight, the families who matter will know that Celine Vale sat across from Lucien Moretti and walked out with his signature. They'll also know someone shot Damien in the alley. Yes. And that Vassetti sold us out. Yes. And that the network has a wound." She looked at the folder. "It's not a clean win." "There are no clean wins," Marco said. "There are wins and there are losses, and most of them are dirty. What you did today is a win." She didn't say anything. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere behind the closed door there were people working on the man who had told her 40 minutes before they walked into a trap that he would prioritize her over the outcome. She thought about that, about what it cost him to say it, about what it cost him to then walk into the room and hold the line anyway. "Marco," she said. "Yes." "Vassetti, where is he now?" "Miami. We have a location." "What happens to him?" Marco was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to happen to him?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about the man she'd never met who had spent 11 years inside Damien's organization, feeding information to the man who had ordered her family's death. She thought about the elevator, about what the last 5 days would have looked like if the man in that elevator had been more efficient. "I want him to not be a problem," she said. "He won't be." She didn't ask for elaboration. She understood, in the way she was understanding many things now that she hadn't understood a week ago, that there were decisions that existed in this world that she was going to have to find a way to live with. Not make peace with, not absolve herself of, but live with, the way you live with any truth that costs something to carry. Her grandmother had lived with 30 years of those truths. She was beginning to understand what that weight felt like. Noah arrived at 6 o'clock. Marco had sent a car for him, and he came into the corridor in his hoodie and his socks and shoes, and looked at Celine with the specific expression he'd been giving her since childhood, the one that meant he'd already assessed her condition from across the room and was now running through the list of things he wanted to say and deciding which ones were worth saying. He sat down next to her. "He okay?" He meant Damien. "Stable." "You?" "Functional." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. His face, too sharp jaw, their grandmother's eyes, the slight shadow under them from the medications and the broken sleep of the last 5 days. He looked older than 23 and younger than 23 at the same time, in the way people look when they've been through something fast. "I got what we went for," she said. "I know. Marco told me." He looked at the folder in her lap. "Grandma's documents." "Yes." She really had them, all this time. In a safe deposit box in Queens. Celine looked at the folder too, under the name she was using, with instructions to her lawyer. She paused. The lawyer contacted Celia Marrow. Celia had Marco's contact information through channels I don't fully understand yet. The information reached Marco 6 days ago. She paused again. Grandma planned this. Not the details. She couldn't have planned the details, but the mechanism. She set up a mechanism 30 years ago and waited. Noah was quiet for a moment. She knew you'd need it, he said. She knew someone would. Celine's throat was tight. She kept her voice even. She was surviving, not disappearing. She repeated the words she'd said in the Meridian room, the words that had come from somewhere she hadn't fully understood until she'd heard herself say them. She was always intending to come back. She just didn't know in what form. In you, Noah said. She didn't respond. He put his arm around her. She let him. They sat in the corridor in the private hospital that didn't appear in any directory, and she let her brother's weight against her be the thing that kept her from feeling how exhausted she actually was. What happens now? He said. We take the folder to the right people. We make Moretti's acknowledgement real by making it witnessed. She paused. And then we figure out what the Veil name means going forward. Does it have to mean anything? We can't just, she said, not harshly. We tried that for 26 years, Noah. We were invisible and it almost killed us anyway. The protection isn't in the hiding. Grandma figured that out, and she was right. She looked at him. The protection is in being too visible to remove quietly. He thought about that. I hate that you're right, he said. I know. I also hate that you sound like her when you say things like that. Something broke open in her chest at that. Not painfully, not the sharp kind. The old kind. The kind that had been sealed for 3 years and was finally finding an exit. Good, she said quietly. That's good. The door opened at 8:47. The doctor who came out was a woman in her 50s with the particular calm of someone who had spent decades handling emergencies and had metabolized urgency into something quieter and more reliable. She looked at Celine first, read the room the way experienced people read rooms, and addressed her directly. He'll need rest, real rest, not the kind where he's working from a bed. She paused. He won't do that without someone enforcing it. I'll enforce it, Celine said. The doctor looked at her for a moment with an expression that said she understood the full weight of what had just been volunteered and approved of it. 20 minutes, she said. Then he needs to sleep. Celine went in. The room was dim and smelled of antiseptic and the particular stillness of a space where serious things had recently occurred and were now being managed. Damien was propped slightly, the right side of him wrapped in the white of the dressing visible above the hospital gown. His color was off, the gray undertone of someone who had lost blood and was being compensated for it mechanically. The cut on his jaw from the night before had been cleaned and closed with 2 small strips. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like a man who had been through something, not diminished, just real in a way that expensive suits and cold control didn't permit. He looked at her when she came in. The folder, he said. I have it. Moretti's signature. Yes. He exhaled. One long, careful breath, the kind that hurt at the ribs and was worth it anyway. Good. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She put the folder on the small table and looked at his face. He looked back at hers. You should have stayed in the doorway, she said. Someone was behind you in the alley. Marco was ahead of you. His voice was quieter than usual, the volume reduced by whatever they'd given him, but the directness intact. I was behind you. Someone came through the east service door and I was between them and you. He paused. I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not asking you to apologize. Then what are you asking? She looked at him for a moment, at his face in the dim light, at the man who had told her in the back of a car that the strategic calculus had stopped being purely strategic and had then walked into a room and held the line anyway, and had then taken a bullet in a service alley for a reason that didn't require explanation. I'm asking you to not die, she said. That's what I'm asking. Something moved through his face. That expression, the one she'd been catching fragments of for 5 days, and was now, in this room, finally reading in its entirety. It was not romance exactly, or not only. It was something more foundational than that. Recognition. The specific recognition of someone who had been operating for a very long time in a world that required the performance of invulnerability, discovering another person who could see behind it and was not using the sight as a weapon. "I can do that," he said. "You're going to rest," she said. "Actually rest, not work from the bed." The Moretti acknowledgement needs. "Marco and I will handle the distribution." She watched him process that. Watched the instinct to argue run up against the physical reality of what arguing would cost him right now. "You trained me for 4 days. Let the training work." He was quiet. "The Morrow woman," he said. "Celia, she wants to meet you. Tomorrow, or the day after, whenever you're stable enough to—" "You don't need me there for that." "I know I don't need you there." She said it plainly. "I want you there." Another silence. This one different from the others, not the silence of two people managing tension, but the silence of two people who have come through something and are finding out what exists on the other side of it. "Celine," he said. "Rest," she said. "We'll talk when you're not running on blood replacement and whatever they gave you." "I'm serious." "So am I." She stood up, picked up the folder, looked at him once more, the whole of him, the reality of him, the man who had looked at her humming her grandmother's song in his penthouse, and decided, for reasons that were partly strategic and partly something else, and partly the kind of thing that doesn't have a clean name, to pay attention. "I'll be here in the morning." She turned toward the door. "The song," he said. She stopped. "Sing it," he said. "When this is finished. The whole thing. In the right place." She understood what he meant. The harbor house. Palermo. The place where her family's name had been taken by fire. "Yes," she said. She left the room and closed the door quietly behind her. The next 72 hours were the longest of her life, and also, in some strange compression of experience, the most clarifying. Marco drove her to 3 meetings in 2 days. She went to each one with the folder, and with the information she'd been given, and with the thing that had been hardening in her chest since she'd sat in a corridor outside a hospital room and understood that surviving was not the same as disappearing. She went to each meeting as herself, not performing anything, not managing an impression, just the woman she actually was, which turned out to be more than enough. The first meeting was with 2 men who remembered the Vale family. They were old. One of them had been present at the gathering Damien had described, the one where her grandmother's song had silenced a room. When Celine walked in, they looked at her with the same expression she'd seen described, the seeing a ghost quality, the recognition of something they'd thought was finished. She put the folder on the table. She told them what it contained. She told them what she wanted. Neither of them argued. The second meeting was with a woman named Priya Mendez, who ran a significant portion of the financial infrastructure that connected the Eastern families. She was 44 and precise, and had the quality of someone who had survived in a world that didn't traditionally make room for her by being better at the important things than everyone who tried to exclude her. She looked at Celine with something that was not quite respect and not quite assessment, but lived in the space between. "You held Moretti to a signature in a room with armed men," Priya said. "Yes." "While Damien Russo was bleeding in a service alley." "He wasn't bleeding yet when I was in the room." "But you didn't know that." Celine looked at her. "I knew what I went there to get." Priya looked at the folder, then at Celine, then she picked up a pen. The third meeting was with a man Celine never got a full name for. She knew him only as a channel, a conduit between the network's current structure and the federal investigations that were always orbiting it. This meeting was in a coffee shop in Evanston, and it lasted 11 minutes, and at the end of it she understood that the documentation her grandmother had preserved was going to serve 2 purposes simultaneously. It would function as leverage within the network, and it would function as a shield against the network, because the federal investigators who received a precise, organized 30-year account of the 1994 operation would know exactly who had provided it and would understand the cost of removing the provider. Her grandmother had thought of this. Celine understood that now, with the full weight of it, Eldavale had spent 30 years constructing a protection she never lived to deploy, had built it carefully, piece by piece, with the patience of someone who understood that survival was not an accident but an architecture, had passed on the key components, the name, the song, The documents, the network of quiet loyalties to the woman who could use them. Not because she knew it would be Celine, because she'd made Celine into someone who could. She drove back to the hospital on the evening of the second day and found Damien sitting up in the bed with a laptop that the doctor had clearly not authorized, and an expression that said he'd been working for at least 2 hours and was prepared to defend it. She looked at the laptop. She looked at him. "I was resting," he said. "Mentally. That's not what resting means. I closed my eyes for 4 hours. The doctor said, I know what the doctor said." He closed the laptop with the careful deliberateness of a man making a concession he considered reasonable. "Tell me about the meetings." She told him. All three. She told him what had been said and what hadn't been said, and what she'd understood from both. He listened with the focused attention she'd come to recognize as his primary mode of engagement, not waiting for his turn to speak, actually listening, tracking everything, building his understanding as she built her account. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Priya Mendez," he said. "Yes. She's been neutral for 6 years. She's not neutral anymore." He looked at her. Something in his expression that was rare, the quality of genuine surprise, controlled immediately, but present for a moment. "In 2 days," he said. She wanted the veil name to resurface. Celine sat down. She remembers what it meant before 1994. She remembers what the network looked like when there was a counterbalance to Moretti's expansion. She paused. A lot of people remember. They just needed something to align with. And now they have it. Now they have it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the bed and picked up the small object from the nightstand. A pen, just a hotel pen, the kind that ends up in pockets and on tables, and turned it in his fingers the way she'd seen him handle things when he was thinking. "Vassetti," he said. "Marco told me." "I should have." "You couldn't have known." "I suspected," he said. 2 years ago I had a reason to look more carefully at him, and I chose not to. I considered the relationship worth more than the doubt." He set the pen down. "I was wrong. That cost us. Cost us 1 night and 1 ambush and 1 bullet." She looked at him steadily. "It didn't cost us the meeting. It didn't cost us Moretti's signature. It didn't cost us the 3 days after." She paused. "You're allowed to have been wrong about 1 person in 11 years. In this world, 1 person is... I know what 1 person is in this world," she said. "I had 1 person my entire life. 1 person who knew who I actually was and chose not to tell me. 1 person who built everything I am and left me to figure out what to do with it." Her voice was steady. 1 person can be a catastrophe, and 1 person can be a foundation. Sometimes the same person is both. She looked at him. "You're not the only one who was wrong about someone they trusted." He looked at her. Not with the controlled expression, with the real one. "Your grandmother," he said. "I'm not angry at her," Celine said. And she meant it. She'd spent the 3 nights in the hospital corridor, working through what she thought she'd feel, and finding that anger wasn't it. What she felt was more complicated and more honest than anger. She made a choice that cost her everything so that I could eventually make a different one. I can be sad about what that cost her without being angry about it. That's more grace than most people could manage. "It's not grace," she said. "It's just, I understand now. I understand what it costs to survive and what you sacrifice to do it and what you hope will come from the sacrifice." She paused. She hoped for this. For someone to be able to make different choices than she had to make. She paused again. "I'm going to be that." The room was quiet. Outside the window, Chicago was dark and lit and ongoing, the way cities always are, indifferent to specific dramas continuing around them, the 10 million ordinary lives that would never know any of this had happened proceeding in their ordinary directions. Celine thought about the woman who had cleaned windows in this city for 8 months, who had hummed a song she didn't understand and started a chain of events that had burned her ordinary life to the ground. She wasn't grieving that woman. That surprised her. She'd expected to grieve her. What she felt instead was something more like recognition, like she'd been moving toward this configuration of herself for a long time and hadn't known it, the way you sometimes only understand what you were building after it's built. Celia Morrow, Damien said. Tomorrow. I'll be there. The doctor said, I'll be there, he said. Not defiance, just fact. She looked at him, at the bandaging at his ribs, at the cut on his jaw, at his hands on the blanket, still, present, the hands of a man who had carried a great deal for a long time and had decided, somewhere in the last week, that carrying it alone was not the only option. Okay, she said. Celia Morrow lived in a townhouse in Lincoln Park that was smaller than it should have been for a woman of her standing, decorated with the accumulated objects of a life lived in close proximity to things that mattered. She was 68 and moved like someone younger, and had her eyes full of a thing Celine recognized before she could name it. The specific look of someone who has been waiting a very long time for something and is now watching it arrive. She opened the door and looked at Celine and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You have her hands." Celine looked down at her hands. The calluses from the cleaning equipment, the short, unpolished nails, the small scar on the left wrist. "She told me once," Celia said, stepping back to let them in, "that she'd given you everything she had left that was worth giving. She said she didn't know if it would be enough." She looked at Celine with those waiting over eyes. She was wrong to doubt it. They sat in Celia's front room, and Celia talked for 2 hours. She talked about Elda, not the ghost the network remembered, not the strategic survivor who had built 30 years of protective architecture, but the actual woman. The woman who had made Sunday dinner and grown vegetables on fire escapes and watched game shows and taught her granddaughter a song in a language the granddaughter didn't know. The woman who had laughed at specific kinds of jokes and been impatient with slow walkers and cried once in front of Celia on the anniversary of the massacre and never mentioned it again. Celine listened to all of it. She let every piece of it settle. When Celia finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Damien sat beside Celine without speaking, which was the correct thing, which she noticed. "She knew about you," Celia said to Damien. "She tracked the Russo network from a distance. She said you were the closest thing to trustworthy that her world had produced since everything fell apart." A pause. "She also said you were going to be a difficult person." "She was right," Celine said. "She was usually right," Celia said. Celine looked at the window, at the ordinary Lincoln Park street outside, a woman walking a dog, a man locking a bicycle, the completely unremarkable machinery of daily life continuing in its daily way. "The Palermo property," she said. "Yes. When Moretti transfers it," she paused, "I want to rebuild the harbor house." Celia looked at her. "Not as a residence," Celine said. "Not as a symbol, just as a place. As a place that exists and has the right name on the deed and that I can stand in front of and sing the song properly." She paused. "She never got to go back. I want to go back." Celia's expression did something complicated and then settled. "Then you'll go back," she said simply. They left Lincoln Park in the early evening, Celine and Damien in the back of Marco's car, the city going past the windows in its usual indifferent way. Damien was quiet, and she could tell the day had cost him, could see it in the way he held the injured side, the careful management of his breathing, the fatigue that had finally arrived at the surface of his face. "You should have stayed in bed," she said. "I needed to be there." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because you were there. Because you were meeting the woman who was your grandmother's closest friend and learning things about your own history, and I—" He stopped, started again. "Because I wanted to be there for it." He said it plainly, not strategically, not for any operational reason. He paused. "Just because I wanted to be there." She looked at him for a moment, then she reached across the seat and took his hand. Not dramatically, just took it. The way you take someone's hand when you've been through something together, and the something is finally, for the moment, finished. He looked down at her hand. Then he turned his palm and held it. They rode through the city like that while the lights came on around them and the lake went dark at the edge of everything, and Chicago did what Chicago always did. Continued regardless, in all its cold, bright, indifferent beauty. 6 weeks later, Celine stood at the edge of the Palermo harbor in the last light of an October afternoon. The harbor house was there, still standing, rebuilt from the damage of 30 years and a fire that had been intended to be permanent. The deed had transferred 7 days after the Meridian meeting, Moretti's formal acknowledgement moving through the proper channels with the specific efficiency of a man who had decided that the cost of resistance exceeded the cost of compliance. The acknowledgement before the relevant families had occurred 2 weeks after that, in a room she had stood in and watched old men hear the truth of 1994 for the first time and understand what it meant for the structure they'd been operating under. None of it had been clean. None of it had been simple. There were ongoing negotiations and a financial structure still being formalized and relationships being rebuilt from foundations that were 30 years cold. Damien stood beside her. His side had healed. Not fully, not without the permanent reminder that old injuries leave, but functionally. He stood without favoring it, which she'd noticed 3 days ago and hadn't mentioned, and which she thought he knew she'd noticed. Noah was behind them, sitting on the low stone wall that bordered the harbor, looking at the water with the expression of someone who was trying to absorb a place they'd never been, but that had always, in some essential way, existed inside them. The water was the color of dark steel going gold at the edges where the sun was finishing its work. Celine breathed in, salt and stone and something older than either, the specific smell of a place that has absorbed a great deal of living and holds it still. She thought about her grandmother standing in this harbor, the young woman she'd been before everything ended, before she'd made herself invisible and crossed an ocean and built a life from the wreckage of another one. She thought about what it cost to survive. She thought about what you carry when you decide that surviving means intending to come back. She opened her mouth and sang. The melody came out low at first, the way it always had when her grandmother sang it, starting small, starting close, before it found its full register. The old dialect moved through her without hesitation, the sounds her mouth had learned before she'd understood language, before she'd understood anything except that this was the song, and the song mattered. The harbor held the sound strangely, sent it back in a way that felt like answer rather than echo. She sang it all the way through. When it finished, the harbor was very quiet. The water moved. A bird crossed the far edge of the sky. Damien's hand found hers. She held it without looking at him. She kept looking at the water, at the harbor, at the place where a fire had been meant to end something and had instead only deferred it. The blood returns to the sea from which it came. The sea does not forget. She knew you'd come back, Damien said quietly. She made sure I could, Celine said. Noah's voice came from behind them, lower than usual. It's a good song. She almost laughed. She didn't quite. Yes, she said. It is. The sun finished, the harbor went to dusk, and the name that had been buried for 30 years stood in the place where it had been taken from, in the mouth of the woman who had carried it without knowing she was carrying it, and it was not a ghost anymore. It was simply what it had always been, present, alive, fully arrived.